let's go ahead and get started. So, this is our first kind of real class session with wilderness management. Welcome back. And we have kind of some groundwork to do today. If it clears up a little bit outside, I don't want us to be like shivering in the mist or whatever, but we'll head outside and start that ball rolling for the semester too. Okay, so the first thing we want to do before this class, kind of to lay things out, is kind of just define what we're talking about this semester, because we got a whole bunch of words. This is like the third or fourth paragraph of the Wilderness Act, 1964. And it's got a whole bunch of words in there that had a very specific meaning in 1964, and these specific words kind of set everything else in motion in a very specific direction. So when we talk about, wildlands, wilderness, just land management, forestry, stuff like that, everybody's coming in with kind of a slightly different background or just a whole lot of ignorance, right? I mean, most people are not getting the training that you guys are in what we're doing. So, that means they're free to bring in sort of whatever preconceptions and misconceptions they got. Yeah.
Are you referring to, as an example, like when they try to bring in autumn olive, like down here, for example, like
Yeah.
they didn't understand the background or
Right.
yada yada yada?
Yeah, they were trying to engineer a solution to a real problem. They found essentially habitat for, and mass-producing species of birds.
Yeah, too good.
Unfortunately, there are always some side effects. We're gonna get the positive main effect of generating, a lot of pretty decent food supply for a whole bunch of species, and at the same time, we've been sort of just screwed by it ever since. So in the 50s and 60s, bringing in non-native species for stuff like that, and before that, during the Great Depression, Civilian Conservation Corps planting a bunch of non-native pine around here to do soil stabilization. They're trying to fix an immediate problem, and trusting us essentially
Clean it up.
to fix any side effects, any
There's still-
unintended consequences. We always get those.
There's discussion about making like blah invasive species, right?
Oh, interesting.
Like making like legislating it as an invasive.
Okay, that makes sense.
I know, like,
At least in areas, right?
cause Dr. Ruffner's against it, but there's also like sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but
You're good.
one of Schoonover's grad students was very pro making it invasive, so it's a hot topic.
You know.
No, it was, I think, Nicole. She was here when I was a freshman.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that.
I just assumed it was a natural pine.
No, Bob Molly was brought in.
So what we're kind of thrusting toward here is this paragraph right here is pretty good. It's pretty tight. There's not a lot of wasted words here. And what that does is it cranks up the importance and the effects and the side effects of every single word in here, every phrase. So we're going to come back to this paragraph over and over and over this semester. It's a very healthy thing. Because this is the legislation that sort of blasts us off the launch pad on wilderness management. And you think in the 1960s when this was written, now we'll get into the history stuff a little bit later in like a complete sweep through on history, but I just wanted to go through this together with you guys. Again, we're going to go back to this over and over and over, so get real comfortable with this paragraph throughout the semester. And by the end, if you kind of know it inside and out, forwards and backwards, you're going to be in great shape. So here's the thing, right? Sentence one, it's establishing that it's not necessarily posed as a problem, but the fact of the Anthropocene, even though they didn't have that word for it back in the 50s and 60s, it was really about a 10-15 year period where the influential people were sort of getting together, putting their heads together, talking about this idea of wilderness, leading up to the 1964 Wilderness Act, so 50s and 60s, late 40s. they're recognizing that, okay, the Industrial Revolution has pretty well revolved by the end of World War II, right? I mean, you know, we have huge amounts of war-making capacity, and the economy and the military-industrial complex of the United States is just going into orbit in terms of size, influence, power, productivity. And this is kind of just highlighting that, saying, hey, you know, we live in a mechanized world now, and we came up in not a mechanized world, so that's different. What do we do about it? All right? A wilderness in contrast with those areas where man and his works dominate the landscape. All right, so we call that the Anthropocene these days. It's hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man. All right, so there's our first kind of archaic word. Untrammeled is kind of like slightly post-Shakespeare. Go back to that. Where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. So, a wilderness is hereby recognized as defined by something it lacks, the permanent presence of humankind. Man himself is a visitor who does not remain. So that's kind of weird, right? And that's kind of a remarkable definition, because if you think about how, you know, like 100 years before this, the western frontier wasn't closed. There was a huge chunk of the continental United States that people just didn't really know about in the early 1800s. It just, like, a few people had been through, fur traders, trappers, stuff like that in the 1700s, but, you know, it's kind of, at least to the western eye, kind of a no man's land in a way. And obviously it was populated with a bunch of First Nations folks and all that. But in that really just kind of 75 years between the closing of the frontier in 1890, so the West is now no longer the Wild West, it's just the West. They're saying, okay, we need some of that wild, and we've kind of overshot how much de-wilding is going to be okay. All right, so an area of wilderness is further defined to mean in this act an area of undeveloped federal land. Imagine defining your spouse by something he or she is not. Undeveloped, untrammeled. Is undeveloped federal land retaining its primeval character and influence? Primeval, okay. So that's kind of got like Optimus Prime and evil right in the name. That sounds like, okay, we'll get into that. Primeval character and influence, without permanent improvements or human habitation. Which is now halfway through this first paragraph, like, what, close to 100 words in, we finally switch over to what it might actually be, which is protected and managed so as to preserve its natural conditions, and then some specific criteria to kind of flesh out what that even means, okay? So the next part goes pretty quick. Which generally appears to have been affected primarily by the forces of nature. Generally appears to have been. So it doesn't have to be real, it just has to look like it, is what they're saying here.
It's like the Hoover Dam.
Think about that for a second. What do you mean by the Hoover Dam?
Well, some big ass beavers, man. Not like that, but like, isn't it like a national kind of in a wild kind of a thing, but like it's in a valley sort of a thing.
It's
So-
in what used to be a very wild place, and then you dam it up, like the Hetch Hetchy Valley, for example, a little bit further north, and yeah. What is it in?
I don't know.
So to speak.
No, I don't.
All right.
You say like a dog.
No, because I don't, That was a national recreation area.
Yes.
Most of that area.
National Recreation Area. Yeah.
Is the Hoover Dam something similar? Yeah.
Lake Mead? Yeah.
Oh, right, yeah.
All right. So this is a thing. This is. Make sure our recorder's still going. Oh, it's stopped. All right. All right. Nope, that was a screenshot. Dang it.
That's okay, we all would like that screenshot anyway on the course menu. Since you said we gotta learn that whole thing for the whole semester, so.
All right,
That
we're
was
good.
pretty useful, since you didn't make a boo-boo now.
So the issue is that we have a super broad, vague list of things that it ain't. And then we start drilling down a little bit in some criteria on what it could be, as they say in the South. But there's a whole lot of heterogeneity, as you guys know, a whole lot of variety, difference, uniqueness across the federal lands of the United States. And so this is going to be tricky to actually deploy on the ground. So the criteria that we're going to try to check off, the boxes we got to check are generally appears to have been, past perfect tense. So in the past up till now, and it's not specified how far in the past. So that's a little bit tricky. What do you do with a ghost town? Nobody's lived there for 100 years, but you can still see some ruins of structures. Can that count as wilderness? Where does the have been kick in? All right. Generally appears to have been affected primarily by the forces of nature, with the imprint of man's work substantially unnoticeable. So, no problem with being a forester in a wilderness area, right? We just gotta be invisible. Because we gotta manage wilderness areas, it just can't look like it. So that melts some people's brains. 2, it has outstanding opportunities for solitude. Well, that sounds pretty subjective, so we'll have to drill down into what that is. Because what if something's kind of on that borderline of, it's, it's pretty outstanding, but it's not like outstanding. It's like a hard 7 out of 10, making our wilderness areas. All right. Anyway, outstanding opportunities for solitude, which is like the positive form of loneliness. It's going out someplace away from other people in a way that you choose for constructive reasons instead of being like forever alone. Or it's a primitive and unconfined type of recreation. So, getting away from crowds, which is going to be tricky in some of our wilderness areas that get real popular. Like thousands and thousands of people wanting to access them generally around the same time. Or a primitive and unconfined type of recreation. So if any of you guys remember the Gadsden flag of serpent chopped up in a section that says "Don't tread on me," right? This is kind of speaking to that sort of a person. So, any of you guys, when you go out in the woods on a hunting or fishing trip, or just walking with your dog, or just whatever brings you out there, is one of the reasons that you go to do that so that nobody can be bugging you. Like, are you the kind of guy that turns your phone off on purpose just to get out there a little bit, right? That's what they're talking about. Decades before cell phones are a thing, but not actually that long before all this technology starts networking us real tightly together. 3, it has at least, and this is a kicker for anything east of the Mississippi, at least 5,000 acres of land, or is of sufficient size as to make practicable its preservation and use in an unimpaired condition. So that's a fancy way of saying, if you guys have a local park, it can't be wilderness. Like, for all these other reasons, things that it can't be and things that we're gonna try and make it, or steer it back towards being what it once was originally, it's just physically not big enough to provide solitude if you can hear other people's dogs barking anywhere inside of it, because sound travels. It just cannot be wilderness if you take a deep breath full of air in the middle of this parcel of land and it smells smells like diesel smoke from a highway right by there, and all the noise pollution and, you know, rubber particles coming off of vulcanized tires and stuff like that. Like, it's got to be big so that you can really kind of get lost in the middle of it, like meaningfully get lost on purpose. Okay. And or it's got to be of sufficient size as to make it basically a functional collection of ecosystems. So a tiny little stream headwater area, tributary of a river, it's not going to be big enough because there's a whole bunch of farm fields maybe upslope that it's draining, for example.
Why would they even put the 5,000 acre thing in there and then contradict it within the same sentence?
Doesn't that seem like kind of an arbitrary thing?
Yeah.
President's asking for some kind of a number, I don't know, with some 5,000 acres? No.
Or at least big
10.
enough.
Yeah, big enough, right? So in the 1960s, we're doing a kind of planning called rational comprehensive planning, where it's a bunch of white dudes smoking cigarettes, their sport jackets off in Washington D.C. office buildings, kind of putting some of this stuff together. Now, not in the case of the Wilderness Act, but that's the context in which this is being written and presented and kind of floated to Congress and the president. And so, with that, you get kind of this idea of, all right, we're the experts in whatever you're trying to legislate or whatever. We're gonna kind of design this thing from the top down, from the get-go. We're gonna put it into motion, and yeah, we can fix stuff later, you know, amendments, stuff like that, subsequent legislation, policy, all of that. So we get kind of some of those artifacts in this because they had to sort of couch stuff in a way that the president and Congress could receive it and function with. So we get stuff like at least 5,000 acres. It's a totally made up number. Totally made up number. But that's the best they could do at the time with not GIS, a bunch of paper maps, and not super well-informed land management of the time, right? So landscape ecology is like a couple of decades old as a science, right? Forestry, a couple of centuries old at this point, but this is kind of a new area of forestry. Everything up to this point in forestry has been about learning how to coppice trunks and stuff like that to provide more firewood for more people, sustainable town forest plots for firewood, for watershed, stuff like that. Like, there's still paint drying on stuff, or there will soon be paint drying on stuff like the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, right? We're still hammering a lot of this stuff out, just kind of out of whole cloth, if I can mix my metaphors a little bit, okay? So, the or makes this much easier for you and me, the guys and gals trying to do the actual land management. So, it's gotta be at least 5,000 acres. There are some parcels like that, and this is mostly directed at the Forest Service and Fish and Wildlife Park Service. They'll get rolled into this in some of these later paragraphs we're not talking about today. But, yeah, your district forester, your forest supervisor can pull out the map of Shawnee National Forest, of Arapahoe, of Fish Lake, of any of them, and just look at any of the districts, entire districts, or sort of logical parcels inside of those districts, and do their early GIS, the gravimetric method, where you just put a bunch of tracing paper on the paper map, draw the boundary of the thing you're looking at, you weigh the paper, and then you weigh 1 acre worth of paper and figure out how many acres you got based on the weight multiple. Like, that's how they were doing this stuff, literally by hand. I mean, about as analog as you get.
They didn't use, sorry to interrupt, they didn't use, or since they're in Washington DC, I'm assuming they might have had an archive of, especially out east, like they could have looked up the land management surveys?
Oh, like plats and stuff like that?
Yeah, why didn't they, I'm just,
Yeah, to an extent, but remember, this is gonna go into effect, and they're going to have to do all of that. So all of a sudden, every national forest, every national park, every wildlife refuge, etc., all of those staff, they have 10 years, we'll see a little bit later on, to to pull out all these maps, and it takes 10 years for the head of Forest Service, et cetera, and their counterparts in the other agencies to basically just compile a list of, okay, we found some spots that are 5,000 acres. We also found some, this one's like, it's like 1,800, but it's so good. There's like no roads in there, there's no old mines for people to fall down in. Like, this is a pretty cherry spot. It just doesn't hit that criterion, so we're gonna lean on this or clause right here. We're gonna make a case that this is pretty wild in there, let's make that one a wilderness. It's a little bit smaller, but that's okay. Now, some of these first wilderness areas, right, they're gonna be huge interior sections of national forests out west. So 5,000 acres, not much of a criterion, because we're gonna check that box super easy for most of them, right? So this first pass, this first 10 years until 1976, is gonna be kind of like all the low-hanging fruit, just all the spots that are just pretty straightforward.
Like yellow, like.
Yeah,
like all
exactly.
All the easy ones out
Right.
west, and like Arcadia out east, and, not Denali.
Not Acadia.
Really?
Yeah, not Acadia. We'll take a look on the map here of why not. And we'll see pretty quickly that the way they've got this set up, if you're looking at, now we have satellite imagery and aerial photos and stuff, at least publicly accessible, you can see, okay, yeah, this doesn't make sense as a wilderness area, because on Mount Desert Island, there's like a dozen small towns, and the whole island's only like 75,000 acres. Yeah, there's a ton of people there. It's a lobster fishing community as well as tourism and all that stuff. So, this makes sense. It's got to be at least 5,000 acres, or it's got to be like functionally big enough that we can do some forestry and get it through what will become restoration ecology back to its natural state. Nash.
So I'm sitting here thinking, Garden of the Gods Wilderness area,
Uh-huh.
Shawnee. I think most of us probably been in that area.
Yeah.
Good area.
And have you guys been to any of the wilderness areas around here?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Cool. Good. Perfect. Go on.
I don't know how well that falls into this act as it being a wilderness.
It doesn't.
Like
It
not
literally
even
doesn't.
really at all.
Right.
Because the first two, kind of, ish. Not so much the second one. The first one, to a degree, but we're in the eastern United States, and this area was all acquired, not from just a completely natural state. People have been there before. Then the second one has outstanding opportunities for solitude. Not really. I don't know. Every time I've been out there, it has been, even when I'm like way back there backpacking, it has been like I see regularly other people in the mornings. I'll walk by other people's campsites.
Yeah.
You know how it goes. And then 3, it's not 5,000 acres. And 4, the ecological, geological, or other scientific features, all of those cool spots, like the geological ones that I'm thinking of, are not considered part of the wilderness area because they have roads that drive you right up to it.
Pretty much.
Correct.
Recreation.
All of that is absolutely correct.
So
What you're going to have to do is tune in for our next episode to see if Goku can get the last Dragon Ball. So this was
Damn you, cliffhangers.
later on in this act. This is only like, I don't know, 5-6 pages, whatever it is. It's super short for a piece of legislation, and pound for pound, it did a lot. There was a second Wilderness Act, sort of.
Like in the 70s to
Like,
amend this? Or-
exactly,
Okay.
exactly. Called the
Wilderness 2
So
Act?
did they
Eastern
like-
Wilderness Act.
Did they go out of their way to like fake post this?
No, it sounds like a bunch of lawyers sitting there going, we're covering our ass doing this thing.
So it's a little bit of both, right? Parts of this are pretty vague, okay? What
The
is...
full definition is just aggravating.
Yeah, what does outstanding opportunities mean? Okay, somebody's going to have to sit down and actually define that. So this is law. How it actually gets played out on the ground is called policy. And then how it actually gets done on the ground is management. And each step in that process adds more detail, adds more clear definitions, adds more numbers like 5,000 and stuff like that. Okay? Yeah. So,
Google what the smallest, natural wilderness preservation area is, it's 5.5 acres.
Is it in Delaware?
Pelican Island,
Oh, yeah.
Florida.
right.
Yeah, but that's pretty secluded.
5.5 acres of land,
5.5
and then
acres.
typically they'll
They'll have to.
have a pretty big swatch around it for
Sounds like they can,
the water as well.
That's
the
wild.
largest
This is
one,
crazy.
largest one's gonna be in Alaska, I guarantee it.
But if you go to Pelican Island, you got 5.5 acres of space, and
Yeah, but
not a road going right to the geologic features. Not a bunch of
You're not gonna have
air pollution, or at least sound pollution, from like the strip mall just on the other side of the hill, right? So this is why they're trying to build in some ores. Outstanding opportunities for solitude. Check on 5.5 acres out in the ocean. Or a primitive and unconfined type of recreation. Okay, 5.5 acres, not really that unconfined. But it is primitive. There's not like flush toilets on Pelican Island, as far as I know. At least the CIA hasn't told us about any. So, anyway. So we're getting this idea here that in this like critical paragraph of laying out what it ain't and what it is, there's some slop in here, right? They would call it some room for growth, some room for specification in the next 10, 20 years, right? They saw this as a process, not a completed thing. All right, so it's got at least 5,000 acres of land or is of a sufficient size as to make practicable its preservation, meaning like you can legit actually get the stuff done. And use in an unimpaired condition. We're not gonna have to dynamite out a whole bunch of stuff to put in or return the natural condition. And fourth and finally, it may also contain ecological, geological, or archaeological, or acoustic, or whatever. That list is gonna grow, so they just put in other. And all of a sudden, now we can argue at least, if we want to get some areas set aside as wilderness, okay, it's not ecologically unique, it's not even geologically unique, but look at these geothermal features here, and the fact of the ground boiling all the time makes it impossible for us to put a road in here. That's why we haven't already. Let's wrap the wilderness designation around this space, and yeah, maybe it's not that big, but it's got outstanding value in this way. So, scientific, educational, scenic, or historical value. That's a pretty big net. And this was modeled on the 1916, about 50 years before, Organic Act created the Park Service, which basically has exactly the same language in for the why are we going to spend people's tax dollars on this new federal agency that's just going to be managing parks and stuff like that, right? We have historic values. We have a story here in the United States. We have scenic values, a lot more than most countries do. We have educational value everywhere, scientific value everywhere. These are the benchmark reference sites against which we can compare how degraded, how messed up, how developed everything else is, and have any sort of reasonable comparison there. Yeah.
Do other countries like Canada or Australia, for example, have this sort of act? And if they do, is it similar or different than ours if you know of, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. We'll talk about this in more detail in the international section, but the short answer is yes, and it goes all the way up to essentially the United Nations level.
That's what Akamai's doing kind of with this stuff then?
Yeah, think how much smaller a lot of like Central American countries are relative to us, and how huge parcels of mostly or all natural land, how difficult that would be just within the borders of like Panama, for example. Internal space, a little bit tougher for some smaller countries. So, transboundary wilderness areas, parks, stuff like that, yeah, that's absolutely a thing. So yeah, there's some pretty impressive ones on the U.S.-Canadian border, for example. And it's a pretty cool collabo, or it's Canada featuring its neckbeard in management on a versus track. So, like I said before, we should be able to see, or at least look at any spot on the face of the planet and just kind of intuitively, without even having to memorize all of this, be like, yeah, that looks wildernessy versus not so much, right? So let's do exactly that. Let's get a sense of this. All right, so for all my homies out of Kankakee, we got Kankakee River State Park. And I'm pretty well zoomed in. Our scale bar at the bottom here is 1,000 meters, around a half mile. Okay, so just over a half mile wide, a little bit less than a half mile wide, around spots like Chippewa Campground. So, would we consider this a good candidate for wilderness?
No.
Why not?
There's roads on either side running almost parallel.
There's roads in it.
Historical value. I don't know the historical value of Kankakee.
State Park has a bunch of active, industrial farms with synthetic fertilizer.
Ag fields, just
Yeah.
intermittent.
They got a really large, roaded campground just stuck in the middle there.
Yep.
Yeah, looks like RV camping.
Yeah.
And so for a state park, yeah,
That looks like a retirement home right over there.
it's actually pretty nice, right? It's close to Kankakee. It's accessible to people. It's pretty easy to get to. It's pretty easy once you get there to get into it and set up your pull-through, stuff like that. All those are not pull-through sites for the most part, but you kind of get the idea, right? This is a highly developed area. These may or may not be full hookup RV sites, but I mean, concrete pads, flush toilets in the bathhouse, probably Wi-Fi eventually, right? The 5G coverage, probably a thing. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know Kankakee, no judgment. So we can see just qualitatively, we'd say, without having to get out the ruler or the GIS to tally up the number of acres. Yeah, okay. This is not really making sense. So one reason that the 5,000 acre thing is useful for us is what Dr. Holzmuller, a GIS guy, would call the edge to interior ratio. You guys familiar with this idea here?
Yeah.
Well, four of us are. Oh, 1, 2, 3 of us are.
Let's go through it just in case. All right, so if we have a riverine state park, a fluvial system, it's this long ribbon of a park. Like on summer camp, we'll see at C&O Canal National Historic Park. It's over 100 miles long, and in places it's like 200 meters wide, right? So there's a lot of edge, a lot of kilometers of edge, and not a lot of hectares of interior space, right? So if we had an area the same size that was perfectly circular, that's mathematically the minimum amount of edge to the maximum amount of area. So the perimeter to area ratio, edge to interior ratio, is the edge to interior is going to be low in a more circular area, or an area that's like most national forests, right? A lot of them tend to be kind of like rectangular-ish, and that's kind of closer towards a circle. A square is not that far off. But a long, skinny ribbon has a high edge to interior ratio.
So we want our wilderness areas to be low, so that way they have more space that's like not bordering civilization.
Yes, right? There is no place you can go here and not hear a modified pipe motorcycle, right? You just can't get far enough in to get away from the roads. You just can't. There's no like mountain ridges blocking those acoustics and reflecting them up into the atmosphere. You know, if you hit a mountain slope, the sound wave bounces up and away. That's just physically not a possibility. Okay, so it can't absorb. One criterion we'll see a little bit later is it can't absorb a 2-week pack trip. There's just not enough interior space to get away from that edge to just go ramble for 2 weeks. And you figure 15, 20 miles a day for 2 weeks, it's gotta be a pretty big space, a couple 100 miles of trails in there. Alright? Now, it's totally okay if, let's say we have another wilderness area, like, let's take a look at something that's very slightly different than Kankakee. The Desolation Wilderness, which is the most metal wilderness name. Okay. Desolation Wilderness. As I zoom way, way out, and we make our map bar like 5 times as big as the one in Kankakee down here. 5,000 meters, so a couple of miles per scale bar here. We've got one road down along the shore over here on Tahoe, and then a whole bunch of roadless space. Because it's a bunch of mountains, right? I mean, this is not rocket surgery, okay? It's hard to run roads over places like Dick's Peak. Okay.
It would get pretty limp at time to time.
That's right. And you don't want any of that, like,
There would be washout too. You don't know what could happen on a foreskin
you
area.
got freeze, thaw, thrust action. It's gets soft and sloughs off like the road falls down the side of the mountain. It's not good.
It happens.
It's not good. Okay. And in Denali National Park, there is a road. We'll talk about why that is for specific reasons in wilderness management, and how they're spending tens of millions of dollars to repair short sections of that road because it's in a mountainous wilderness area, all right, near the highest peak in North America. So this just looks different than outside of Kankakee, right?
Well, obviously, yes, because we're past the other side of the Mississippi. However, the terrain
Yeah.
is different because you can see the scattered trees versus in Kankakee it was very forested.
Absolutely. Absolutely, no question.
Thank you, Postman.
Okay. So we're gonna see right away that Howard Zahniser and the Forest Service guys that were, guys and gals that were drafting this back in the day in the 50s, and then shopping it around up till 64, like, they realized, you know, east of the Mississippi, pretty settled, right? And in the 1950s and 60s, even more of it was cleared and settled than we have right now. Like, the Shawnee National Forest wasn't a thing, and wasn't gonna be a thing until, what, the 90s? And the Shawnee is one of the smallest national forests in the system. So they knew right away, look, we're gonna have to, let's just get the low-hanging fruit in the 60s here, and that'll give us some time to hammer out the kinks in the system, get our workflow working, set up our logistics chain, and we can circle back on some of the harder stuff like Southern Illinois, which is a lot of farmland, but yeah, maybe someday, not us, but our successors will have a chance. We'll give them the headroom to do round 2 and later generations of this legislation. All right?
Sorry to interrupt again, but
Yeah.
is in between the lakes one of those then national protected areas is? It's over 5,000 acres and it's here on the east.
That's a great question.
I think that's a recreation area.
It is.
Yeah.
So that's the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of there's like natural character, size, and then there's like administrative use of the space. So if you have 2 identical mountains, you can use one of them for wilderness maybe, and if you designate the other one as a national recreation area, that's totally the opposite, right? Let's put in some ATV trails. Let's find some cliffs with big flat areas up top we can land a helicopter on and go base jumping off of.
Yeah, but isn't the whole point of have that to have nature, and aren't you destroying it to get that though?
Well, that's kind of
That's
the
what we wanna talk
trade-offs
about
of
last
management
year,
going on
I
there.
don't
Well, that's
understand
Yeah.
like, yeah, that's like what the wilderness thing does is specifically lay out an
that.
area.
I know, but I'm trying to be that nitpick asshole. It's like, wait a second here. It's like the old Jewish man, like, wait a minute here. From like that Howard show.
So So the guy who's a total wilderness snob and is going to be backpacking his way solo through that space, and he's going to be, building his own shelter. He's planning on hunting his own food in there, gathering some wild edibles, stuff like that. That needs a very high productive, untrammeled, not sort of tied down, subjugated, squared away, military style. It's just got to be just all the tumult of nature, right? At the far end of the spectrum, the guy who's sinking an equal amount of money not into backpacking gear, but into his sand rail or dune buggy. He's got an equal legit interest in getting into a recreation area and opening up the throttle and throwing up some rooster tails of dirt, right? That's a lot of fun. So is wilderness backpacking, but they can't be compatible. It's kind of terrifying to go walking on ATV trails at Land Between the Lakes because some of these guys are hitting 40, 50 miles an hour before dropping it into 4-low and going vertical and wall climbing and stuff. Like, this guy needs gas stations right there, And this guy needs gas stations not to be there. So to make sure that we got something for everybody, we manage these completely differently. We concentrate a whole bunch of use on a recreation area.
Basically, like, a wilderness area is somewhere where, like, you need proper gear, training, or gear knowledge of, like, how to use it.
Don't you need proper gear
Yeah,
and
I was gonna say
training
you need
to
to
do
I mean,
wall crawling?
A recreation area is somewhere where, like, a city boy that's taking his family camping and he's only ever camped once when he was 8.
A city,
You
yeah.
go out there, set up a tent,
Yeah.
buy some firewood, and
Brings animal ash bowl over because you got to whip it out of state.
I'd say, I think the best way to describe it is probably like opportunity cost between the two. So like if you mess up something skill wise on a recreation area, you're more likely to have immediate access or close to immediate access to help or a gas station or anything like that, food. Whereas in the wilderness area, if you mess up a skill thing, you could be completely isolated and
Wants
lost.
to start a wilderness fire.
Yeah.
I mean, shit. You gotta get found somehow.
So we need both. Look at it. Look at the same problem or the same opportunity, if you want to look at it that way.
What different ends of the spectrum?
In your classes, you have to take some classes that are like, all right, crack open your textbook, memorize these things, memorize these tree species, and every week regurgitate what you memorized on our tree quiz. We have to have that. And we have to have some classes where we don't have a textbook. Not really for this class. Because that's not the right tool, right? So this is a tool for certain people for a certain kind of fly fishing. And this is also a tool for people who fly fish. It's just a different kind of vibe with it, yeah? Okay? So that's okay. We'll see both of these on our field trip, on our summer camp trip and stuff like that. That's kind of the point of it. Okay? So, right away we're seeing that this class is taking for granted that the Forest Service exists, Park Service exists, Fish and Wildlife, Bureau of Land Management, all those organizations, all the state level stuff. This class is mostly about federal. This is good. I'm gonna let you finish, Taylor Swift. Like, keep on living your dreams as a forester over here. The entirety of this class is just the subset of places that are wilderness, all right? So, we're not in the 60s here going through and saying, all right, this 500,000 acres area right next to the Fish Lake National Forest, that is now a wilderness area. We're saying this part interior to the Fish Lake National Forest, 500,000 acres, this is wilderness now. Okay? And we're gonna stop doing stuff like logging, extraction, whatever else. Okay? Cool. All right, let's center right there. We've got about a minute left, so we'll end a couple minutes earlier. And I'm around for questions if you guys have them. Otherwise, see you on Thursday. See if we can't crack and open the egg here and talk about our field trip too a little bit more. Start planning that right away.
Sweet, dude.
All right, boys.